Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Today, I'm going to look once again at Harvest of Sorrow by Robert Conquest. This is his history, and it's one of the kind of the seminal histories of the Soviet famines. Um, and last time we were talking about the mounting tensions between um, the Stalin regime and the peasantry, and the poor information and data that was being received by Stalin and his commissars that indicated that there were grain shortages, where in fact, actually, that would appear to not be the case. Um, and it comes down to poor information gathering and a kind of a weak system for kind of transferring accurate information. And this has disastrous consequences because Stalin's assumption is, well, there's plenty of grain out there, the peasants are hiding it. So in January 28, writes Robert Conquest, came what the American scholar Stephen F. Cohen rightly called the pivotal event. Faced with, or believing themselves to be faced with, a grain shortage, the Politburo voted unanimously for extraordinary or emergency measures. The rightists saw these as a limited expropriation of kulak grain, and when it developed into a mass confiscation of grain from the peasantry as a whole, conducted with almost as great brutality as 1919 to 21, they complained. But basically, it was the whole decision, even though granted by all factions to be temporary and not to involve the end of the NEP, the New Economic Policy, which was fatal. For the party was seizing grain which had been produced for profit under supposedly guaranteed market conditions. The seizures provided the state with the grain it wanted, but it demonstrated to the agricultural producers that market conditions could no longer be relied on, so the economic incentive to produce, already shaken, was largely destroyed. At the same time, the party's success in confiscating the grain gave it the false and shallow idea that here was a simple method of solving the problem. So there are unintended consequences all round. Firstly, it just tells the peasants either don't produce any grain or hoard it. Market conditions of buying and selling, free exchange, that's dangerous. And then it convinces the government that if you requisition once, you can requisition again, and you can kind of keep doing it, and that will solve your problems. Um, but it's really simply kind of just cannibalizing the food system. And it shows us that this kind of ignorant, bureaucratized, violent expropriation works very well if you are of that persuasion in the short term, but leads to catastrophe in the long. For the grain deficit of just over 2 million tons was more than made up. The emergency measures producing nearly 2.5 million tons. Stalin described the emergency measures as absolutely exceptional, but the methods employed could not fail to remind the peasant of war communism. There was a mobilization of cadres. 30,000 activists were sent to the grain-growing regions. In the villages, emergency troikas were set up with full power to overrule local authorities. The village, district, and provisional party organizations were harassed with purges of weaklings. The grain markets were closed. The amount of grain which the peasants could have ground in the mills was limited to a minimum for their own consumption. In effect, though the centre from time to time deplored excesses, the requisitions of the civil war had indeed returned. Stalin's policy of attack on the kulak, requisitioning in the village, was in fact close to the more extreme variants of the left programme, and then Przebrzydzenski gave it full support. Okay, so in this, I guess it's instructive to talk about war communism. War communism was Lenin's state control of industry and the food system, principally for the purposes of winning the war, the civil war against the whites, and this involved the mass expropriation of the peasants. You need to feed the workers, you need to feed the armies, and the peasants are, in Lenin's eyes, kind of at least class dubious, if not actually class enemies, and are the possible sort of czarist supporters anyway. Lenin is deeply prejudiced against the peasants, and Lenin had no long-term plan to give any land to the peasants, even though he said that in the April Theses. Instead, he is intending to sort of expropriate the land anyway at a convenient moment. And so, taking requisitioning food from the peasants this is no problem for him, really. And of course, it leads to famine on an epic scale and a deep hatred and mistrust of the Bolsheviks by the peasantry from that moment onwards. Robert Conquest writes, and now, again as in 1919, the middle peasant, by far the largest category, began no longer to have adequate representatives in the village soviets. In some of the Ukrainian provinces, their share fell to under 30%. Moreover, such organs as the electoral committees, which in fact determined the composition of these soviets, had only a bare majority of peasants of any sort, as against officials and others. A law of the 10th of January 1928 changed the quorum rules for the village commune meeting so that a third of the members might bind the rest. Peasants deprived of the Soviet vote were not to vote at the village meeting, whereas labourers without a household gained that right, and decisions of the meeting could be questioned by the village Soviet if thought to be contrary to Soviet policy. This was the beginning of the end of the independence of the commune, and at the same blow, and at the same time, a blow at the middle peasant. So it was about empowering the poor peasants. The Soviet state was looking to do that. And the poor peasants obviously took decisions which generally didn't benefit the middling sorts. And again, there's this fantasy in the minds of the Bolsheviks that the middling peasants are kind of capitalists. And they're not really, because that's to misunderstand the kind of the sociology of the peasant village, where there is a kind of a complicated web of relationships between middling peasants and poorer ones. Middling peasants would often hire poorer peasants, sometimes as a kind of a help, to give them work, to keep the kind of the fabric of the community together. Sometimes it was to use them for their labor. And but the idea that they are kind of capitalists, they're using wealth to accumulate more wealth. Maybe you got one or two, but this is extremely rare, and they weren't thinking in those terms. The idea, there's this sort of Stalinist fixation with some kind of spontaneous peasantry, spontaneous kind of formation of capital. That if you allow anybody to accumulate private wealth, then they will continue to do that, and they will become kind of like a monopolist within the village. And this is extremely rare. But the Bolsheviks didn't actually know a lot about peasant life. They were, in some ways, kind of deliberately ignorant about it, and believed that they had the answers from a kind of a theoretical model. The commune's role under the Tsars of self-taxation now began to be used again on a wide scale. That is, the commune was made responsible for extracting surplus money from the village, and after its new style meeting had been made to accept a given figure. Though since it was laid down that the commune must impose higher taxes on kulaks, whatever the village's own view, the traditional freedoms of self-taxation no longer applied. In fact, official documents make it quite clear that even poor peasants gave little support to the party's scheme, and that the harsh administrative measures then imposed alienated all elements in the villages. So again, the idea that the poor peasants were handed a stick to whack the middling ones with, and did so with glee, isn't necessarily always the case, because these people are neighbours, and again they exist within within context to one another. I mean, sometimes. I mean, I think Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands indicates that this did happen in particularly in the Ukraine. But Robert Conquest argues that actually this is surprisingly unpopular with the poor peasants. Again, because you go into somebody's community and everybody knows each other, and you'll start to kind of tamper with the social relations and give people power to to discipline one another. And not everybody's a taker when it comes to that sort of thing. Though the Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and the Volga were all singled out for special attention, this time Siberia was the main target. Stalin personally went there, the last time he was ever to make a visit to the countryside. He addressed the Territory Party Committee and other bodies and denounced them for incompetence bordering on sabotage. When they protested that the amount of grain he asked for was excessive, he told them while the poor and the middle peasantry had sold their surpluses to the kulaks for huge reserves, 50 or 60,000 pods per farm. This was pure guesswork. Moreover, he contradicted himself, admitting that the largest amount of unsold grain was in the hands of the middle peasant. When it came to local practice, officials who listed all those definable as kulaks but still had not met their quotas were told to fine the rest. But since kulaks, under any definition, did not in fact have surpluses adequate to meet the procurement demands transmitted to local officials, the latter in fact had no recourse but to make up the deficit from the stores of the peasantry as a whole. So the party's chasing a fantasy of this kind of rich, hoarding, sort of manipulative, devious kulak, whereas the majority of the time you're talking about these middling peasants who've got a little bit saved by, a little bit tucked by, and the party want to essentially loot them for grain, but they just haven't got the kind of grain that it is that the party believes exists. And so you wind up in this kind of endless spiral, and party officials who are frightened, Stalin visits himself, this is scary stuff. You'd have to do what he says, and they're frightened of the party, and they're frightened of disappointing, and frightened of not hitting quotas, and so they involve themselves in a gigantic great shakedown. The next part is especially revealing. Robert Conquest writes, indeed, a letter sent by Stalin to party organizations admitted that the kulak was not the major source of surplus grain. So Stalin knew this. He knew they hadn't got it, but was to be combated rather as the economic leader of the peasantry, with the middle peasant following behind. So the wealthier peasants, in Stalin's eyes, were an enemy class, an economic leader who could organize a peasantry against the party. And so we kind of get closer to where Stalin's thoughts really are. As the crisis grew less, it was admitted by Stalin and his supporter Bauman that the emergency measures had included searches, confiscations, and so on, and that the middle peasant's safety margin had been tapped. Stalin himself was to explain with breathtaking frankness what was going wrong. In April and May 1928, there was a shortfall in grain collection. The grain still had to be collected, so we fell once again into extraordinary measures, administrative willfulness, the violation of revolutionary legality, going round to farms, making illegal searches, and so on, which have caused the political situation in the country to deteriorate, threatening the alliance of workers and peasants. The major legal weapon used against the peasantry was Article 107, in force since 1926. It laid down prison terms and confiscation for persons causing deliberate rises in prices or failing to offer their goods for sale. It had never been intended for use against the peasantry, but as a measure against the speculator middlemen, the kind of NEP men that emerged during the Russian Civil War. And so by confusing the two, by making a point that, well, that's kind of what the kulak class is, which is not at all, you create the seeds of this kind of terrible crisis. At the Central Committee's plenum in July 1928, Rykov was able to reveal that in an apparently typical district, the application of Article 107 had involved poor peasants in 25% of the cases and middle peasants in 64% of the cases, with kulaks proper only accounting for 7%. So just to recap on what that means, in some districts, the vast majority of people that are being prosecuted for keeping essentially like a sack of grain under the floorboards are poor peasants, or they are middling peasants, and virtually none of them are the class of kulaks, which are very hard to define anyway. And a published poll of poor peasants later in the year showed clearly that the expected support for government measures was not forthcoming from them. Well, I mean, why would it be when the poor peasants know full well that that's a stick we're going to get hit with? You know, this is not simply a thing that's going to be applied to other people. At this July 1928 plenum, it was announced that the extraordinary measures had been repealed. The NEP had already been reaffirmed in principle at the plenum in April. Stalin gave his support, if in a typically oblique way, to the left thesis on getting industrialization capital from the peasant, while also covering his NEP flank. The way matters stand with the peasantry in this respect is as follows. It not only pays the state the usual taxes, direct and indirect, it also overpays in relatively high prices for manufactured goods in the first place, and it is more or less underpaid in the prices for agricultural produce in the second place, so we are able to kind of fleece them. It is something in the nature of a tribute, of a super tax, which we are temporarily compelled to levy in order to maintain and develop our present rate of industrial development, in order to ensure the industry for the whole country, further raise the well-being of the rural population, and then abolish altogether this additional tax. These scissors between town and country, unfortunately, our industry and country cannot at present dispense with this additional tax on the peasantry. So he's saying, well, it's kind of too bad, unfortunately. But Stalin continued, are the peasants capable of bearing the burden? They undoubtedly are. Firstly, because this burden will grow lighter from year to year, and secondly, because this additional tax is being levied under Soviet conditions when exploitation of the peasants by the socialist state is out of the question, and when this additional tax being paid in a situation in which living standards of the peasantry are steadily rising. So the peasants are getting better anyway, and it's out of the question that a socialist state would exploit them anyway. So, you know, it's all okay, really, which is all so much kind of flim-flam, because Stalin really knows what the game is here. Yet he was able also to tell the plenum that pressure was being kept up on the capitalist element in the countryside, to the extent of sometimes ruining them. On one view, Stalin had only wanted by the emergency measures to frighten kulaks into submission. At any rate, new directives went out to stop extraordinary measures, raise grain prices, send manufacturing goods to the countryside. But the more prosperous peasants had indeed taken fright. Some planted less, others sold up their property. For by now, prices did not even cover the cost of production, as was admitted by Stalin's chief economist, Strumilian. And in general, the grain producers naturally responded to the compulsory seizures by losing any desire to increase production, and the sheer hard work by which the peasant had revived the country's agriculture started to fade away. So at the end of 1928, the party was faced with the results of its handling of the agricultural problem come back to roost in worse form yet. Both grain and livestock production began to show a decline by the autumn of 1928. Moreover, with the increase in population since 1914 taken into account, grain production per capita had gone down from some 584 kilograms to, this is obviously per person, per capita, to 484.4 kilograms. When the market mechanism had failed to give satisfaction, requisition made up the shortfall, and the government then went back to the market. But from the peasant point of view, the market was no longer a reasonably secure outlet, but one that might be superseded at any moment by requisition. If you think that the government is going to do things that you cannot trust and cannot rely on, then it's going to influence and shape the behavior of producers and suppliers. And in the further deterioration of market relations this produced, the government remembered the success it had with forced requisition, and it did not reflect that it was the requisition of grain that produced with the incentive of the market, and that in the new circumstances this was certain to shrink in quantity. Quantity. It is perfectly clear that it was not hoarding, but low production that was the essential. Bukharin spoke of fairy tales of grain hoarding. Okay, so I'll leave you there, guys. But remember, if you're studying Russian history, join our masterclass. Join it today. There are limited tickets available. We'll be going live on Sunday, the 25th of January. And if you want to listen to these podcasts without adverts, join us on Patreon and you get to hear the whole thing without interruptions. Thanks very much, and catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.